Hey guys, Quiv the Lazy Geek here, and today finally we're going to talk about the actual optimal exposure time. Now the first thing I'm going to do is just show you what the rule of thumb, like lazy method is, the happy-go-lucky, don't worry about things, astrophotography shouldn't be frustrating, everything's going to be fine, and we're all going to be okay method. In other words, my method, which is simply to look at the histogram. Okay, first things first, let's take what most people know about a bias frame. A bias frame is basically a frame with the shortest possible exposure for the camera to kind of measure what is the default read noise plus pedestal, so plus offset of the camera. So let me, you can see I have my exposure time in Nina right now. I've set it to a humongously low value. I don't even know whether the camera is capable of that. Let's see, the camera is currently at -3 degrees. I'm actually going to wait until it's at -10 before I take the bias frame to make sure we're on the that everything is on the same criteria. Okay, we're roughly at -10 degrees. I have the dust cap on, so I'm taking more or less a dark frame for a very short exposure time, so a bias frame. It's set in there, and I'm just going to take one exposure. We're going to see it is indeed a bias frame, and we're going to look at the histogram, and you can see like mean and median here at around like 3,000 something. Okay, so my goal will be when I expose for real, I want to have a value of my histogram that's significantly higher than that without going like more than 1/3 to the right of the left-hand side of the histogram. Obviously, just to explain a bit what a histogram is simply the number of pixels of a certain brightness in your image. So the x-axis here is the brightness that has been measured, and the y-axis is the number of pixels that have been measured with that brightness. So we can see the sensor currently with the bias frame, it had tons of pixels that were measured at this brightness and a few pixels measured at that brightness, right? So it's low brightness as expected since we have the cover on. By the way, my bias measurement is probably wrong because of this little light there, and there's probably some light leak going on, but let's not worry too much about that. Now let me open that cap. We remember this value of roughly 3,000. We're opening the cap, and now I'm going to take, like, let's say a 10 seconds exposure. See what that gives me. 10 seconds. Let's take that. Okay, I had to move the scope because it was not tracking, but we have a 10-second exposure. We can see the result here, and we see that we have mean, median, so like the peak of the histogram at around 4,000. And by the way, the measure here of the brightness is an ADU, that ADU that we talked about last time. So it's 4,000 ADU out of the roughly 19,000 that are available for this camera. Awesome. So that exposure time actually is significantly higher, right, than the exposure than the bias frame. So I'm likely perfectly fine with this exposure time. I could try to like exaggerate it a little bit by putting it at 30 seconds and see what I obtain. And my 30 exposure is done. 30 seconds exposure. We're now like between roughly like 5,500, 6,000. We're not too exposed to the right. It's probably much higher than the optimal exposure time, but I'm not going to saturate anything. Everything's fine. We're all good, and I can go with this exposure time. End of story. That's it. You don't overthink it. That's one way of doing things. And honestly, it's worked pretty well for me, especially from here in Tokyo. I think it can work pretty well for a lot of people as well. Not overthinking it. You just want to be have a mean and median of your exposure, of your histogram, that is significantly higher than your bias frame. Here we are. 30 seconds, it's more than significantly higher. It's like twice. And, it gives me a good compromise. That's it. Now, there is a feature in Nina to compute the optimal exposure time, and this is based on the work by Dr. Robin Glover, whom I mentioned in the previous video, and again I'm linking down below to his explanations and videos, where basically you have an actual formula to swamp the read noise, to basically get sufficiently high above the read noise to have an optimal exposure time. And there is a calculator in Nina to basically get to that exposure time automatically. So for that to work in Nina, you want to go first to options and equipment, and you want to make sure that the bit depth for your camera is properly set. Now, I've already mentioned that for this camera, the bit depth of the sensor is 14, but actually the camera and the ASI driver convert that to a 16-bit bit depth. So from Nina's point of view, it's a 16-bit camera, and that's it. So I leave it at 16-bit, and this is the case for all ASI cameras. I don't know about QHY or other manufacturers, but for all intents and purposes, from Nina's point of view, it's a 16-bit camera, and this is what we're going to use. And then in the imaging tab, you can see that you have a calculator icon here on the top right, and this is the optimal exposure calculator. And I'm already going to tell you, it's probably going to give me very disappointing results, because probably with exposures of 1 second, I might already be swamping my read noise, because thanks to light pollution and also to this light here, well, swamping read noise is very easy because I have a bit too much light available. Okay, so once I click on that, there's this optimal exposure calculator tab that appears, and it's time to put some information in there. So first there's the exposure time, which defaults to 30 seconds by default. I'll put it to 10 because I know that 10 seconds will give me, an exposure with stars. It's not saturated, it's not completely dark, it's like a good middle ground. So this value, exposure time, you put it in after you've done a couple of tests to see, where your histogram is putting you. So okay, 10 seconds. I can select my filter, which would be, for me, it's the L filter because it's a color camera and I don't want to restrict myself to just the set of red pixels of that camera. My gain, it's 101 as usual. And there's a use SharpCap sensor analysis. If you have SharpCap Pro can actually measure the characteristics of your sensor, which is basically the graphs that ASI provided on the video I showed last week. So you can use that as is, and then you don't need to put in the full well capacity or the read noise in electrons. But, I trust ASI. Yeah, well, I trust ZWO, and let's go back to their website so I can actually get their data for my gain, which is pretty much the unity gain. So unity gain, the read noise is 1.5 electrons. So I'll put that in Nina. And the full well depth is like, oh, this is logarithmic, it's a bit more difficult to compute, blah, blah, blah. But actually we know that we are at unity gain. So we have 1 electron per ADU, which means that my full well is just the count of ADUs. The count of ADUs is 2 to the power of the bit depth of this camera, which is 14. And it's 16,000. Okay, so we're going to input those two values in Nina. We have roughly 16,500. It doesn't need to be too precise, so I'll put full well capacity at 16,500 and the read noise at 1.5, and we're all good. I could also input the bias information that I captured, which was, if I remember correctly, around 3,000. Or I could just, recompute the bias using the calculate bias feature here. I would ask you to cover your scope. Let's do it. To cover your scope, and it will just take a bias frame. So here it is. I've covered my scope. I'm going to say OK. It takes a bias frame, and it will take, actually it seems it takes the median of that frame and puts it in there. So, OK, why not? Kind of wondering whether it should be taking the mean rather than the median. It's a good question. I'll try with both. And then I'm going to take my actual exposure on the stars to see what Nina recommends. And I can guess it's going to recommend like 1 second or 0 seconds, something weird like that. And here we are. And as I expected, it's recommended a 1 second exposure time. And this is thanks to this and thanks to the light pollution. With just 1 second of exposure time, I'm already swamping the read noise of my camera. Obviously, I am not going to take 1 second exposure times for a whole night. I don't have the hard disk capacity and I don't have the processing capabilities to deal with that. So I've already seen that with my rule of thumb, 30 seconds works fine, so 30 seconds it is. You see, so you have flexibility with your gain, but you also have flexibility with your exposure time. As long as you don't saturate your star cores, you're fine. You don't have to be super precise. So, you look at your histogram, it's sufficiently above bias. You're not completely to the right of your histogram, so you're not overexposing anything. You're good. You're good. Sufficiently detached from the left and like less than 1/3 of the histogram, and you'll be fine. That's kind of my conclusion. Now, I'm kind of wondering, this bias, it's taking... it took the median. The actual mean was something like 34.6, if I remember correctly. So I'm going to try with this mean. And here we are. As expected, I get a higher exposure value because it kind of changes the floor that I'm trying to swamp. And here we are. That is the recommended exposure time calculator. Now, note that read noise is not unique to CMOS sensors. This should work for DSLRs and it should work with CCD cameras. But as you can see, the results that are given can be pretty surprising, especially in areas of high light pollution. Or if you have very low light pollution, and you're pointing to a very dark patch of sky, then you might get a recommended exposure time that is super, super long. So again, you don't have to be too precise. You can play it by ear, use the histogram there as I usually do, and you'll be fine, seriously. And I think that's it for this time. This is a pretty neat tool to have in there, especially since it could use like the sharp cap sensor analysis. But I hope this has been useful. I hope you understand more about exposure times, and also I hope that you understand you don't need to overthink things. It will fall into place using rule of thumbs. Okay, that's about it. Thanks for watching. I hope it was useful to you. If you like this video, please click like and also subscribe, because there's tons of good content coming up as usual. And always, don't forget to look up, and I'll see you next time.